Tonight is the debut of the UFC on ESPN and ESPN Plus. Of course, you can get that free ESPN Plus subscription free for 7 days starting today if you want to watch the fights on your digital, whether it's your PlayStation, your phone, your iPad, whatever it may be. And joining us now, longtime ESPN MMA insider Brett Okamoto, as the fights are in Brooklyn tonight. Brett, how you doing on this Saturday?
Oh, I'm doing great, man. Yeah, looking forward to the fights. How are you?
Doing well. But before we get into the fights specifically, I want to ask you, because you've been covering this sport for a while, talk to the audience for a moment about the significance of UFC finally being on ESPN, because, the UFC in its overall formation has been around since the early 90s, but in its current, under the unified rules of MMA and with Dana White in charge, it's really only been around for the last couple decades. And for it to come to ESPN, what does that mean in your eyes?
Well, it's a big deal. I mean, I think it's a big deal for anyone who's been involved in the sport. I don't think the sport was still in that era that it was maybe 10 years ago, where it really felt like it was fighting for validation or fighting for, I guess, just to get noticed. I mean, I think that era kind of came and went, but what this represents is just, I think the exposure levels are going to just jump off the charts. With the infrastructure that ESPN has, it's the worldwide leader of sports. MMA was very healthy. I mean, obviously the UFC sold for $4 billion 2 years ago, so it's not as if this industry was struggling at all. But now it has a home on a channel that everybody knows as sports, recognizes as sports, and now you're going to hear these guys' stories. And I think once a lot of just casual sports fans hear more about the individuals who are in the sport, they're going to obviously care a whole lot more about it. I think that's what ESPN brings to the table.
Historically, beyond the main event, it's been hard for some people, whether it's any fight organization, to sell the whole fight card. And UFC has kind of always been built around we're more than just the main and co-event. So, how can being on ESPN, ESPN Plus, in your mind, elevate the profile of some of these other fighters?
Yeah, a lot of it was what I was kind of referring to, just in forms of storytelling. Like, for instance, I mean, before this card, I went out and did an entire Sports Center piece, an entire Sports Center feature on Cowboy Cerrone, and he's not in the co-main event, and he's a popular guy within, the hardcores of the sport. But again, it's sort of those pre-fight stories. I mean, people are going to watch this sport. They're either going to like it or not, but I think if they get invested in some of the individuals, then it's like, even if you're a huge MMA fan or not, you start to learn about these guys, then you want to just find out if they succeed or fail, even if you're not a hardcore fight fan. So I think that'll be a big part of it. And I also just think that seeing the branding of ESPN, having it be on the home of all the other sports, it's just going to feel more like a sport. I think it always was a sport. I think most people sort of categorized it as a sport, but this will really get it over the hump more in that aspect as well.
You mentioned Cerrone. Let's start with him and his fight with Hernandez. The start here, this is a guy, Donald, he's fought at lightweight, he's fought at welterweight, and there's been a distinct change in how focused he is since he had the birth of his child. And it seems like that's really ignited new life into his career. And, I saw you at the ranch with him, and it seems like this is a guy in Cowboy Cerrone who, it's like he's got a new lease on his career almost.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Cowboy's whole thing is that I'll fight anybody, anytime, anywhere. And that may sound like, if you don't watch the sport, you might think to yourself, well, like, aren't they all like that? Absolutely not. They are not all like that. A lot of these guys like to wait for the perfect time or the perfect matchup to try and get a fight, or at the very least, they try to navigate their career in a smart way. And that is smart. I mean, all these guys are trying to win a world championship, and it goes beyond just winning fights. It goes, there's matchmaking that goes into it, and there's taking fights at the right time, and there's trying to chart your path to the top. That's a big part of this sport. But Cowboy was never like that. Cowboy was like, oh, I'm on a 4-fight win streak. You want me to fight a guy that no one's ever heard of and it won't even really do anything for my career? Okay, I'll take that fight, because that's what fighters do. And fans loved him for it. So he is one of the most popular guys in the sport, but he's never won a UFC championship. And I think at age 35, and then as you mentioned, having his son this year, he's like, you know what? It's time. It's time to actually take smart fights, ask for certain matchups, and try to win myself a UFC title before the end of my career.
I know he's talked about Khabib Nurmagomedov a bunch since he won his last fight, but a win over Hernandez, realistically, Brett, How much does that elevate Donald up the rankings?
Not a ton, but you know what it does is it proves that he can fight at this weight class again, because he had been fighting at 170 pounds for the last 3 years. He needs to prove to the UFC that he can cut down to 155 pounds. That's the weight class that he'll be fighting in tonight. And look, Alexander Hernandez is not a well-known name, but he's good. He's very good. He's 2-0 in the UFC, and if Cowboy beats him, I think he'll sort of show the matchmakers in the UFC, like, hey, look, I'm serious about this. I can be a title contender at lightweight. Give me a big fight. And I guarantee you, if he beats Alex tonight, he's going to be calling out Conor McGregor. He thinks that he's got a chance to land that fight, and it's a fight that he really wants.
And that would be a fight I think a lot of people would love to see, too. I mean, two guys love to throw in McGregor and Cerrone, that's for sure, if that was to happen. We got also on the fight card tonight, two women's flyweight fights. Very interesting matchups, Calderwood versus Lipsky on the preliminary, and then Paige Van Zandt versus Rachel Ostovich. Talk about, what those two fights mean, not just for the women involved, but also the women's flyweight division. And because it feels like, for those who haven't been following the UFC too closely, if you're a casual observer, it feels like there's been some changing of the hands and maybe some, not consistent champions going on in some of the women's classes.
Yeah, well, the women's classes are still relatively new. This whole thing got off the ground with Ronda Rousey. Prior to Ronda Rousey, females weren't competing in the UFC, and that wasn't all that long ago. I mean, we're still in really the baby stages of females fighting in the UFC. I mean, just the weight class that you're referring to. So the two fights that are taking place tonight in the flyweight division. This division didn't even exist 2 years ago. It's brand new. It's a brand new division. So every fight that has the ability to bring in eyeballs and to be on a platform like ESPN Plus and to kind of grow that division, all of those are important right now, because that's where the female side of the sport is. It's still growing and still taking in new talent. And these are two good fights. Paige Van Zandt obviously is a very popular fighter. She's kind of broken through into the mainstream with some of the other stuff that she does outside of the cage with the Dancing with the Stars. So she's good to bring in some casual fans. And then that Calderwood-Lipsky fight, it should be a heck of a fight. I mean, you're going to have casual fans again for the first time who are getting introduced to this on ESPN. They're going to look at two women and say, okay, let's see what these two women got. And these two women are violent. Lipsky's nickname is the Violence Queen, and she lives up to that pretty darn well. That should be a stand-up fight. It should be a striking fight. And any new fans who are tuning in for the first time are going to say, wow, these 125-pound women, they really come out and go after it. Yeah,
and Brett, we know that Joanne's afraid of nobody, and that'll make it even better of a great fight there. Speaking of flyweights, I've seen you and different people talk about the fact that, there's some thoughts about what the future of the flyweight division is in the UFC. Without Demetrius Johnson there, and if Dillashaw does beat Cejudo tonight, we know Benavidez is fighting a flyweight on the same card. What do you think the future of the flyweight division is, considering that now that we're on ESPN, now you got UFC with this platform? Couldn't I argue that the UFC being on ESPN could almost backdoor, shall I say, save the flyweight division?
Yeah, I can see why you would make that argument. And for the record, I like the flyweight fights. The 125-pound guys, so some of the audience, it just feels like they can't get behind them, whether it's because they're smaller or because there was such a dominant champion there for so long in Demetrius Johnson. Now Johnson is gone, and it's Henry Cejudo's title. But I don't think I think the UFC has kind of already made up its mind on that. I know that they're not coming out and publicly saying, Dana White's not saying that this is the final flyweight title fight in UFC history. He's not saying that if Henry Cejudo wins tonight, that division will continue. But I just think they've already made up their mind. I think that they've decided that this is this weight class. They put resources into it. They've given it a go. They felt like it never really caught on fire. It never really resonated with its fan base, and I think they're ready to move on from it. So I think if TJ Dillashaw wins, 100% the division is shut down. And I think if Henry Cejudo wins, most likely still, I'm still going to say about 75% that that's the last flyweight title fight we'll see.
So what does that mean for guys like Benavidez, who are much more natural, in their physiology and their height and their size at 125 versus 135? Do you think Benavidez and Cejudo, do you think it's natural for them just to go to 135? Or do you maybe for someone like Benavidez, who, let's be realistic, the guy's not as young as he used to be. He's had some serious injuries. Could maybe he say, maybe I don't want to fight anymore?
I don't think he'll say he doesn't want to fight anymore, and he actually just signed a new contract with the UFC.
Okay.
But it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough for him. He's basically going to. It'll be like he got sent, back to the past, because 6 years ago the UFC didn't have, or 7 years ago about, the UFC didn't have this 125-pound weight class. So all those guys, they were fighting at 135. So Joseph Benavidez has fought at 135 before, and he's done well there. But he also knows that it's just difficult. He's fighting guys who are bigger than him. So he'll have to make a decision on whether he wants to maybe ask the UFC, like, hey, can you just let me out? Can you let me go, let go of my contract? All these guys at 125 who aren't in the title picture right now, they'll have a choice of, hey, can you just let me go so I can go off to another promotion that wants to put on these 125-pound fights, or they will fight up at 135, and that will be challenging for him.
If Dillashaw does win this, he'll be one of the only a handful of guys who ever had belts in multiple weight classes simultaneously. The most recent guys we've seen are Daniel Cormier and Conor McGregor. If Dillashaw does this, he's also talked about going up to 145. How does the UFC balance between a guy jeopardizing multiple weight class belts and letting a guy chase history?
Yeah, I think their hands are going to be a little bit tied. Their hands are going to be a little bit forced here if Dillashaw wins at 125 and then he calls out Max Holloway, because I just don't see how you're going to deny the guy that opportunity, because all the momentum will be behind him. A lot of people are tuning in. ESPN has done a great job of, getting people to know that, hey, we're in business with the UFC now. You can watch these fights on ESPN Plus. So this fight has gotten a lot of attention, obviously, and so people are interested in it. And if they go in and watch, and TJ Dillashaw has a great performance, and now he's a two-weight champion, and he's talking about doing something that nobody in the history of the sport has ever done, and win a third title, people are going to be like, yeah, sign me up for that. I want to see that. And it would just be tough, I think, for the UFC to turn around and say, wait, no, we're not going to do that. We don't want you to move up two weight classes. You haven't defended your 135-pound championship. It's just going to be hard to do that because there's going to be momentum behind it. So I think the UFC would have to let him move up. And in the meantime, those 135-pounders who want a shot at TJ's belt, unfortunately, I think that they're just going to have to wait a little bit longer. Sometimes that's how this sport works.
Now, if Cejudo wins tonight, he'll retain the flyweight belt, and if the UFC gets rid of the flyweight division, is the next natural fight is Cejudo versus Dillashaw 2 at 135 in your mind?
I think so. It's always hard to predict that when you don't know how this first fight's going to go, right? I mean, depending on what happens tonight, we'll see. We'll see how much interest there would be in that. But if it's a good fight and then Cejudo wins, I think the UFC could build a storyline around, well, hey, that TJ was taking a risk and he was doing something that's very difficult, and that hasn't been done before. An active champion trying to move down and win a second title in a lower weight class, and maybe the weight cut affected him too much, or just simply, what does the fight look like at 135 pounds? TJ went to Henry. Now let's see what happens when Henry goes to TJ. So I think that's certainly a possibility. But again, if the fight is boring for some reason, or if someone is really convincingly defeats the other, then it'd be tough to try to book an immediate rematch.
Brett, one more question for you. I appreciate your time here on 97.3 ESPN FM. Brett Okamoto joining us, the Boardwalk Kind of Hotline. UFC 233, it's now gone. It's not even going to happen. The next fight on the UFC event calendar, I believe, is February 2nd, correct? And that's in Brazil. So what's happened with the UFC here that now we basically have just a fight card that is not going to happen? What happens to those guys, and how does that affect some of the UFC's promotion strategy moving forward?
Well, I mean, a lot of the guys who are on that card just were simply rebooked to another card, like either this one or one that's coming up. For example, this fight itself, Henry Cejudo and TJ Dillashaw, that was supposed to happen next week, but the UFC wanted or needed a big fight to put on its first launch of ESPN Plus, and so they moved it up a week. In terms of what it changes for the promotion, I don't think it changes a whole lot. I mean, the UFC has already said that they're not planning on just completely eliminating that planned pay-per-view from its schedule, that even though it won't happen next week, they'll find a spot to put it in. They still want to have 12 pay-per-view events in this calendar year. They don't want it to go down to 11. So, I mean, we've seen this happen. It's rare. It doesn't happen very often, but if, there are just some circumstances where guys are injured or they're just unavailable for various reasons, and the UFC has to bite the bullet and cancel a card. It's something that they really try hard not to do, but unfortunately it did happen with that Anaheim card next week.
Brett, I want to ask a bit of more of a professional, personal question for you. with the UFC now being on ESPN, how has your professional life changed, if at all?
Just that there's more attention on it, and which is great. It's been phenomenal for me because, I've been with ESPN for the last 7 years, and not to say that ESPN hasn't cared about the sport, but of course it hasn't cared in the way that it does now. Now it's invested in it. It's teaching itself about it. I mean, before I came to Brooklyn, I was in Bristol, Connecticut on the ESPN campus running seminars with some other guys like Ariel Helwani and Shale Sonnen, and we were literally just trying to educate people, like what is this sport all about? What do you need to know about this sport? And for me, that was surreal, and it was also just a beautiful moment because now this sport has the company's attention. It has their eye, and I think that anybody who watches this sport, even if you don't end up becoming a fight fan, you learn how to appreciate it, and you learn that there is interest here, and you learn that there are stories to tell here. And so that, for me professionally, is going to be amazing because it's just going to give me more opportunities, more chances to go over to Cowboy Cerrone's ranch, and visit fighters at their homes and tell their stories because there are really remarkable, interesting individuals that compete in mixed martial arts, and more people need to know their stories.
Brett Okamoto has been joining us on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. And follow him on Twitter at @BOkamotoESPN. Brett, it's really exciting to have the UFC on ESPN, and I appreciate you always giving us the time here on the station.
You got it, Josh. Have a good day, man.